This is a work of fiction. All characters, houses, and events are invented. St. Orlan had not opened its doors to the public in 6 years, but it opened that night because a Rourke wedding needed a church old enough that no single family could claim to own it. The building had served, once, as neutral ground where the old houses sent their disputed records, rather than trust a rival to keep its own history honest. A scandal decades earlier had closed its library to the public, but the Covenant archive inside had kept running quietly ever since, staffed by custodians sworn to no family, dismissible by none. Tonight, its nave had been dressed for a wedding instead of a reading, candles lit along both walls, the 3 houses filling the pews in an order that had been argued over for a week. Rourke sat closest to the altar. Vale sat opposite, close enough to matter. The smaller allied families filled in behind them, present because attendance was not, in practice, optional. Damien Rourke stood near the altar in a black suit that fit him the way command usually did, without effort, without a wrinkle out of place. In 4 hours he would either marry Lucinda Vale or lose the provisional recognition the council had given him the day his father died. Benedict Rourke sat in the front row like a man who already knew how the night would end. Below the nave, in a stone room the wedding planners hadn't been shown, Damien set a Bible on the table in front of Celia North. It was heavier than it looked, bound in cracked leather, its edges once gilded and now dulled by 200 years of hands. A silver clasp held it shut like a lock on something the family had decided generations ago was safer closed than read. "Tell me which page they changed," Damien said. Celia didn't reach for it yet. "How much time do I have?" "Until midnight." She opened the clasp, and the spine cracked the way old paper does when it hasn't been asked to open in years. She turned past baptisms, past deaths recorded in 3 different hands, until she reached the page bearing his parents' names. "There's no civil marriage recorded here," she said. "Not for your father and your mother." Damien's jaw tightened, but he didn't interrupt. "That doesn't mean nothing happened," Celia went on. "Civil marriage isn't the only lawful union this book recognizes. I need to know what else is on this page before I tell you what it means." She turned it toward the light, ran a finger along the inner margin without touching the ink itself, and stopped. "Someone replaced this leaf," she said, "and whoever did it didn't only erase your mother from this book. I think they used the same hand to write your uncle a marriage of his own." Damien had spent his whole life afraid this book would call his mother nothing. He hadn't expected it to hand him a second crime in the same breath. The provisional recognition hanging over him wasn't sentiment. Under the council's own rules, a boss who inherited command without a settled bloodline dispute held it only until midnight of the season's first full council session, unless he could produce either a valid book covenant record proving lineage, or a marriage alliance stable enough for the houses to accept in its place. Without one or the other, command would pass to a succession vote. A vote Benedict had spent months quietly building support for. The book covenant had governed Rourke's succession since before any of the 3 houses trusted a courthouse with their names. Damien's grandfather wrote it into practice after a rival family used a public marriage certificate to trace and kill a widow within a year of her wedding. Since then, a union could take one of 3 forms: a public marriage, a widow's succession claim, or a protection union, sealed privately when a public marriage would endanger the bride. Each form required its own seal, its own witnesses, its own line in this book. None were meant to be easy to forge, and none were meant to be easy to erase. A protection union required the abbot of St. Orlan to preside, along with 3 blood witnesses from families outside the immediate threat, and it preserved succession only for a resulting child, not automatic standing for the spouse. It was narrow and deliberately difficult, hard enough that no one in the room could call it a convenient invention summoned to save Damien on the night he needed saving. If there was a protection union, Celia said, there should be an indent on the page behind it, and a seal offset in the binding gutter, even after the leaf itself was replaced. A removed page leaves damage in the pages that held it. She found the indent within the hour, faint letter forms pressed into the following leaf, visible only when she angled a lamp low across the surface. She couldn't read all of it. Enough survived to make out 2 names and a seal shape that didn't match the modern Rourke signet at all. "That's my father's old ring," Damien said quietly, looking at the shape she'd traced onto a strip of film. "He wore a signet before the one I wear now. My mother had one that matched it. I never knew what the design meant. He called her his guarded wife once when I was young enough that I thought it was just a name he liked. A protection union isn't something a husband arranges alone, Celia said. The covenant requires the woman's own request, recorded separately, before the abbot will seal it. If your mother is in that witness ledger, it means she asked for this, understanding exactly what kind of danger she was in and exactly what she was giving up by not having a public wedding. She found the entry a few pages later, in a hand distinct from the abbot's own, a short line, initialed, requesting the union be sealed under threat protection rather than delayed until it was safe to marry publicly. She didn't wait to be hidden, Celia said. She asked to be. There's a difference, and it isn't a small one. It was the first piece of evidence in the room that hadn't come from Celia's hands. She worked the way she always worked, without hurrying to match anyone else's urgency, even with a clock running toward midnight above her head. She'd spent 11 years restoring manuscripts no one else wanted to touch, and she'd learned early that a page rushed through examination told you what you wanted to hear, while a page examined properly told you what had actually happened to it. She didn't dislike Damien. She simply refused to let his fear decide what the evidence said before she'd finished reading it. She sent word to the St. Orlan archive upstairs, the covenant registry the church had kept independent of every house for over a century, sworn to custodians who answered to no family and could be dismissed by none. The current custodian, Abbot Ferris, returned within the hour with a witness ledger bound almost as old as the Bible itself. The seals inside it pressed generations before his own appointment. 3 names in it matched the seal marks pressed into the page. Damien's mother, Marielle Ashe, had been recorded there, not as a wife in the ordinary sense, but as a woman under active threat from a rival house the year she married, protected by a private union sealed before Abbot Severin, 2 custodians before Ferris, and 3 blood witnesses. They hid the union to keep her alive, Celia said. Someone later turned hiding her into erasing her. Damien didn't answer for a long moment. When he did, his voice was quieter than she'd heard it all night. I was ready to marry a woman I don't love because I was afraid this book would say my mother was nothing. She wasn't nothing. She was protected, and then she was written out. Celia didn't offer him comfort he hadn't earned yet. That's a clue, she said. Not a verdict. I still need to prove it, not just find it. She turned to the next section of the Bible, the branch recording Benedict's own marriage, entered only 11 years earlier, recent enough that it should have been easy to verify, and recent enough that it made no sense for anyone to need to forge it at all, unless the point of forging it had nothing to do with his marriage, and everything to do with what it made him eligible to claim. The pigment used for the ink was wrong before she even tested it. St. Orlan kept a reference chart of every restoration batch brought into the building for 200 years, cross-checked against the monastery's own conservation notes. The formula used on Benedict's entry hadn't existed in the archive until a restoration project 6 years after the marriage it claimed to record. Celia laid the reference chart beside the page so Damien could see it for himself rather than take her word for it. A swatch of the same pigment, dated and logged, sitting 2 columns away from a date that shouldn't have been possible. The witness named beside his signature had died 2 years before the date written on the page. That's not a coincidence I can argue around, Celia said. That's a dead man testifying to something that happened after he couldn't have seen it. The seal pressed beside his name carried a small chip in the die, a flaw St. Orlan's own impression register showed hadn't existed until the original seal cracked and was replaced, 8 years after the date on Benedict's page. She held up a wax cast from the registry beside the page itself, the chip visible in both, undeniable once set side by side. Damien sat back for a moment, letting it settle. My uncle ran the house's routes himself for 2 years when my father was too injured to hold them. He always believed that work should have counted for more than it did once my father recovered and took the seat back without much ceremony about it. I don't think he ever forgave that. Motive explains why someone might want a different book, Celia said. It doesn't replace proving they made one. Damien stared at the evidence laid out across the table, 3 separate proofs pointing the same direction. Someone had access to this book long enough to do all of that. Someone had authorization, Celia said, and slid a restoration ledger across to him, an old repair authorized after flood damage at St. Orlan years earlier, signed off by a single family representative with standing access to the archive during the work. The signature at the bottom belonged to Benedict. These aren't 2 damaged records, Celia said. Their one succession plan, the same restoration that let someone quietly remove your mother's protection union, is the same restoration that let your uncle write himself a marriage he never had. Damien looked at the 2 pages side by side, the erasure and the invention, both born from the same few weeks of unsupervised access. He didn't just take my legitimacy, he said slowly. He built his own out of the same page he tore out of mine. That's exactly what the ledger shows, Celia said. Now I need to prove it stands up in front of people who'd rather it didn't. It was midpoint, and the clock in the sacristy read 10:30. Lucinda Vale found them not long after, standing in the doorway with the composure of a woman who had been listening for longer than she wanted anyone to know. She wore her wedding dress already, hours before the ceremony, as though putting it on early might make the marriage more certain. You're spending your last hours as a free man in a basement with a librarian, she said, instead of upstairs where 3 houses are waiting to see you become something worth marrying. I'm trying to make sure what they're waiting to see is real, Damien said. Lucinda's eyes moved to the Bible, to the ribbon marking the disputed page, red and slightly too glossy under the lamp. The original book has to be on the altar for the blessing. That's tradition, not my invention. It'll be there, Celia said. As Lucinda turned to leave, her glove brushed the edge of the table, and when she drew her hand back, Celia noticed a faint tackiness left behind on the wood, the kind of residue a ribbon shouldn't leave in a room this cold, unless something had been added to it. She didn't say anything yet. She only noted it, the way she noted everything else that hadn't been explained, and set it aside as a question, rather than a conclusion. 2 hours before midnight, Damien was summoned upstairs to review the order of the ceremony with the council, and Celia stayed behind with the Bible cataloging what she'd found. She was still working when Benedict entered the room himself, 2 of his own men behind him and a small glass vial in his hand. You've been using conservation reagents on family property, Benedict said, setting the vial on the table. The kind that can make old ink appear where there wasn't any before. I'd like to know who witnessed you use it before you present anything upstairs. I haven't used anything from that vial, Celia said, not looking up from the ledger in front of her. And the indent I found predates any reagent I've touched tonight. Pressure marks don't respond to chemistry. They respond to a hand pressing a pen into paper decades ago. Convenient distinction for someone no one else was watching. Then have St. Orlan's own imaging file checked, she said. It's time-stamped and hashed the moment I captured it, before I said a word to anyone. It shows the indent before I ever touched a reagent, and it shows a partial seal offset the naked eye already caught, imaging or not. If I wanted to lie to your family, the easiest lie was the one you were afraid of an hour ago, that Damien's parents were legally married in the ordinary sense. I didn't tell him that. I told him the truth was more complicated and less convenient than the lie would have been. Benedict didn't have an answer for that, but the 2 men behind him wore Rourke House colors, not St. Orlan Gray, his own security detail, brought in for the wedding and stationed throughout the building like everyone else's, with no one yet suspicious enough to question why they lingered near the stone room instead of the nave. He had a locked door, and men willing to use it before anyone thought to stop them. Celia found herself confined to the small stone room while the ceremony clock upstairs ran toward midnight, the Bible still on the table in front of her, the ribbon still coiled beside it. She spent the first several minutes testing the lock and the small barred window, both useless, before she noticed the dumbwaiter in the corner. An old relic from when the room had served the kitchens above, narrow, dust-choked, but still open at both ends. She wrote 3 lines on the back of a restoration ledger page, folded it small enough to fit through the gap, and sent it up into the dark shaft, with no certainty at all that anyone would find it before midnight came and went. Do not let her light the ribbon. The book is the witness. Upstairs, the wedding attendants had already carried the Bible up for the blessing exactly as tradition required, ribbon and all, well before anyone thought to check whether its examiner was still free to follow it. Damien read the note standing beside the altar, candle already lit for the blessing, Lucinda beside him in white. He didn't ask permission from the council before he acted. He invoked the only authority he still held without dispute, provisional boss of the house until midnight, and ordered the sacristy passage opened. 2 council members objected, one of them loudly enough to draw the attention of the pews behind him. A third, older than the rest, reminded them that under the covenant, any disputed page could only be confirmed by the St. Orlan custodian, standing before witnesses of all 3 houses. and that no House representative had the standing to override that clause, provisional boss or not. "Tonight," Abbot Ferris said, stepping forward from where he'd waited near the transept, "the altar needs someone who can read." Celia came up through the passage with the Bible in her arms, still marked with the ribbon Lucinda had insisted must reach the altar. "Open the book," Damien said, and set the candle down instead of lifting it toward the pages. Celia laid it flat before the council and began where the evidence began, not where anyone wanted her to. She showed them the replaced leaf, the grain of the vellum wrong for its neighbors, the catchword that didn't match the first word of the following gathering, the stitching from a restoration batch 2 decades too recent, the edge gilding retouched over an older, duller line. The last word on the previous page was written to match the first word of the next gathering, she said, holding both under the candlelight so the council could see it for themselves. "It doesn't. This page was not here when this book was bound. The physical evidence doesn't argue about who put it here or why. It only argues about the page itself." She showed the indent on the adjoining leaf next, the seal offset pressed into the gutter, the partial name recovered under raking light, and confirmed again under the multispectral lamp a St. Orlan technician had carried up from the archive earlier that evening, kept ready in the sacristy for exactly this kind of dispute. The old clock above the transept began striking midnight partway through, and for a moment the whole council turned toward it instead of the book. Abbot Ferris raised a hand before anyone could speak. "A disputed covenant record is actively under examination," he said. "The succession vote does not proceed while this altar is still reading." He took the ledger from Celia's hands and confirmed it himself, reading Mariel Ash's name aloud beside the seal mark of a protection union sealed under Abbot Severin's hand 2 generations earlier, 3 witness marks matching the covenant's own registry line by line. "The covenant recognizes this union as lawful," he said, loud enough to carry to the last pew. "It has since the day it was sealed. No later hand had the authority to remove it, and no vote tonight can undo a record this church already confirmed." Benedict stood. "This proves a page was disturbed. It doesn't prove I disturbed it." Celia turned to the restoration ledger next, the one bearing his signature, cross-referenced against the exact repair window in which both alterations occurred. "It proves you had sole family access to this book during the only restoration event, when both changes could have been made," she said. "It proves the witness on your own marriage entry died 2 years before the date recorded beside his name. It proves the seal beside your name carries a flaw that didn't exist in the die until 8 years after that date. And it proves that no monastery register anywhere else in this archive records a marriage matching yours on the date you claim it happened." She let the silence hold before she finished. "None of that happened by accident, and none of it happened without someone in this room deciding it should. Benedict had no dead witness to call back, and no seal that could unbreak itself early." The council elder who had spoken earlier asked him directly whether he could produce any corroborating record from outside this single book. He couldn't, and for a moment his composure went with the silence. "I kept this house alive while your father recovered in silk sheets," Benedict said, "and the book still called me second." "So you rewrote it," Damien said, "until it called you first." Neither of them raised his voice. Neither needed to. Lucinda tried once more, her voice steady even as the room turned toward her. "None of this changes what's practical. A marriage tonight stabilizes this house. The alternative is a council vote Benedict has been building support for since before I arrived. You insisted the original book be brought to this altar," Celia said, and lifted the ribbon marking the disputed page, still faintly tacky under the light. "This has been treated with a resin compound used in book repair, the kind that flares fast and burns hotter than candle wax. Not enough to destroy the whole book. Enough to take exactly the gathering that proves Mariel Ash's union, in a way that would have looked, tomorrow, like nothing more than an old candle too close to old paper. Resin holds a ribbon's shape for the ceremony," Lucinda said. "Every wedding ribbon in this church has been treated the same way for 100 years. If you're accusing me of tradition, accuse the seamstress too. Then the seamstress will confirm the concentration she used," Celia said, "and it won't match what's on this one. This ribbon carries 3 times the resin of a shaping treatment, placed unevenly, heaviest exactly where it meets the disputed gathering. That isn't shape, that's fuel." The council elder, invoking the same covenant clause that had brought Celia to the altar, placed Lucinda under a temporary hold pending the archive's own inquiry, not an arrest. but enough to keep her within the church while her coat and belongings were searched by a neutral custodian, rather than Rourke's security, so that no house on either side could later claim the search had been staged. A folded note, recovered from the lining, read only, "After the blessing, the old question ends. He will have only the veil name to steady the house." It wasn't a confession written in plain language. It didn't need to be, once it was read beside a ribbon that shouldn't have been tacky. A wedding pushed forward faster than tradition required, and a demand that the original Bible, rather than any copy, be the one carried to the altar. "A chain does not become an alliance," Damien said, "because it's tied at an altar." He didn't kill anyone that night, and he didn't need to. Benedict's claim was suspended pending a full covenant audit. His access to the St. Orlan archive was revoked. The restoration records he'd once authorized became the subject of review by custodians who answered to no house at all. Every decision he had made in the family's name over the past 6 years, back to the date of that first restoration, was flagged for the council's review too, since a man who had built a claim on a forged page couldn't be trusted to have kept the rest of his ledgers honest either. Vale's engagement to the Rourke succession ended with it, and the trade routes quietly bundled into the marriage contract ended with that. A real cost, not a clean one, the kind of loss that would strain the house for a season even with the throne secured. Lucinda remained at St. Orlan under the same temporary covenant hold placed on her during the search, pending a full inquiry into how far the ribbon plan reached beyond her own hands. Her house's seat on the Joint Trade Council was suspended until that inquiry closed. Damien kept his seat, not because a librarian had found a way to make him legitimate, but because the same standard she'd used on his own page had been used on Benedict's and on Lucinda's ribbon without softening for any of them. The council elder noted, before the session closed, that the throne he kept came with a cost of its own, a house weakened by a broken alliance, a season of scrutiny into its own restoration history, and no political marriage left to soften either. He didn't take the Bible back to Rourke Manor that night. He carried it, instead, to the St. Orlan archive himself, and asked Abbot Ferris what it would take to keep it there, permanently, under a custody no single house could order changed. Multiple keys, Ferris told him. Conditioned photographs after every handling, copies held by neutral witnesses from all 3 houses. Any future dispute read here, at this altar, the way tonight was read. "With someone my family can't order to edit it," Damien said. Celia stood nearby while the terms were drawn up, saying little. When the room had mostly emptied, he found her still there, closing the clasp on the Bible one last time before it went into its case. "You didn't save my crown," he said. "No," she said. "I saved the page your family tried to bury. What you do with the crown now is yours to answer for." "I'm learning not to mistake ownership for truth," he said. "I thought if I controlled this book, I controlled what it said. I don't think that's true anymore." "It never was," Celia said. "It just took someone willing to open it and tell you what it actually said, instead of what you needed it to say. Books don't call people anything. People write names into them and pretend the paper spoke first." He didn't ask her to stay in his service, and she didn't offer to. There was no proposal in that room, no kiss beside the altar, nothing that turned her into the bride the night had almost handed him by default. What passed between them instead was quieter, an understanding that neither of them owed the other anything beyond what had already been proven, true, and shared. He had spent the whole night learning the difference between controlling a record and becoming worthy of the truth it preserved, and she had spent it proving that trust wasn't hers to give away just because a crown was at stake. "Will St. Orlan send you the next time this book is opened?" he asked at the door. "If the page is disputed," she said, "then I suppose I should stop giving my family reasons to dispute it." It wasn't a promise of anything beyond that night, and neither of them pretended it was. It was enough for now that he'd said it looking at her rather than at the Bible. The Bible went into independent custody the following week, exactly as promised, multiple keys, neutral witnesses, a public restoration log any of the 3 houses could review without asking Rourke permission first. Celia returned to her own work not long after, called back only when a disputed page needed a custodian who couldn't be bought and wouldn't be rushed. A family can replace a page. It cannot make the replacement belong to the book. Mariel Ash's name went back into the record where it had always legally belonged, not because anyone finally decided to be kind to her memory, but because her record carried a provenance no forged page could ever inherit, and it had simply been waiting for someone patient enough to trace it.